Can you all hear me? Oh my God, I can hear myself. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Welcome to, I was going to say welcome to Bantry. You've probably been here longer than I have. I just arrived. Welcome to Bantry, Lisa. It's good to be back. I'm here today with two fellow novelists from Ireland. So we're going to have a chat about their novels. On the far end there is Danny Denton. He is the author of two novels, The Early King and the Kid in Yellow, and All Along the Echo, which is the one we're going to be celebrating today. He has been the editor of the Stinging Fly magazine. He lectures at UCC in creative writing, I might add, like not in engineering or anything too impressive like that, you know. And his work is featured in the Stinging Fly, in Granta, Winter Papers, Dublin Review. And then in the middle we have Niamh Campbell. Niamh is the author of the novels This Happy and also We Were Young, which is the one we'll be celebrating today. She is the winner of the Rooney Prize and the Sunday Times Short Story Prize as well, which is very impressive altogether. Her novel We Were Young is a keenly observed, candid and quite cynical novel about art, about creating meaning and about moving through a world that demands constant reassessment. And its protagonist or guide through is Cormac, who is a photographer in his late 30s. And then Danny's novel All Along the Echo is a shifty, bouncy, profound, moving novel about stories that are told and about voices, literally, because we're following a radio presenter, Tony, and his producer, Lou, as they travel the highways and byways in Ireland and kind of navigate through some thorny issues themselves. So I want to start actually by asking, before we go reading and anything like that, these are both second novels. And tell us a bit about, because you both came from very highly regarded first novels, very highly regarded debuts. So these are kind of follow-ups to well-regarded books. How was the journey for you, Niamh? How did it go? Where did We Were Young come from?
Part of it was overspill from This Happy, so that it was things that were left over that I didn't feel I had dealt with. But equally, when This Happy came out, when your first novel does appear, you can't help but be formed or shaped slightly by the feedback and the reviewing and the way that you are received. So some of We Were Young was an attempt to move away from being typecast in a certain way by writing a male protagonist instead of female. So originally I thought it might be a set of characters and they'd all have some input, but then I decided more and more I'd be really interested in totally going into the mind frame of one of the male characters that I most was attracted to. And then it would become a study in sort of having compassion and consideration, and writing a believable man would be a challenge because my first book was a young woman and I wrote it when I was a young woman in an era of young woman books and it was put in a certain box and I wanted to see if I could do something else. But I do think that they're very linked as books. They both have exactly the same engine behind them, this engine of concerns, just refracted differently. But in order to cope then with the stress of delivering the difficult second album, I wrote it quite fast. So this version of it is the third iteration, and that was written very quickly. Try not to think. Less than a year, this iteration, but there were two doomed iterations before that. So all in, longer than that, but this one quick.
The two iterations before that, were they the ones with the kind of more polyphonic
polyphonic, and then narrowing down to maybe 2 or 3, and then finally submitting to being unable to do that.
So what was it about Cormac that made you go, was it the challenge of creating this kind of believable male character? Was there something about him that spoke to you? Or?
Yeah, he was originally a side character who was a bit shallow. And I thought, I found him the most attractive character. Yeah. I thought he was the most fun to be around. And also there was something extremely melancholy about him. And I wanted to write from his perspective to explain, he's sort of a bit of a flake. He's a bit of a womanizer. My main idea was that this is a man who is supported by a constellation of women and men in his life who doesn't fully acknowledge the level to which he's reliant on them. So how to put someone who is farming out different aspects of their life to other people, where's their center? And then I found in that empty center I could put a lot of things that have actually concerned me over the years about moral behavior and conduct and freedom. And also class ascension and other issues like that. So he just became a really good receptacle for trying to explore these ideas while keeping them realistically lined up with a masculine energy instead of feminine. Yeah. And it just got more interesting than writing sort of what seemed to be a comedy of manners became more like a tragic.
Yeah, there is this, it's definitely like the book does have this kind of like, it's quite a melancholy book, I think, in many ways. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And I think it's really interesting what you said about being typecast as the young female writer, because Danny, you have escaped this, but we have not, tragically. And we're all the same, we all write the exact same book, and you know, it's great fun all together. Danny, tell us a bit about All Along the Echo. How did that come about after Early King?
A kind of a similar thing to Niamh in the sense of trying to do something different. So like the Early King obviously is a dystopian novel, or was marketed and kind of reviewed as a dystopian novel and had loads of dystopian aspects. So I was like, I won't do that again, I'll try something different. But I also had this thing of everyone coming up to me going, when are you going to write a book set in Cork? And I'm a person pleaser, so I knew I had to write a book set
any of the
in
people
Cork.
who asked you that people who went to the Bantry West Cork Literary Festival? Because I'm wondering.
No comment. No, they'd probably say, when are you going to write a book set in West Cork? It's a different county, I think. So that was part of it, trying to do something different. I found it just like writing a first novel, like talking about like the business side of it. The Early King was a one-book deal, and your dream comes true, your book comes out, you get loads of attention for about 3 weeks, and then you're left alone, and it's almost like you get an encouraging email from an editor and everything going, "Are you working on that second book? Love a read," but there's no commitment. So you're kind of thinking, am I ever going to publish a book? Like at a certain point I was thinking, am I ever going to publish a book again? Because this one was taking ages as well, and it was changing dramatically from draft to draft. Like the protagonist of the first draft doesn't exist in the book anymore, so like pretty drastic changes. So there was a bit of that, a bit of kind of like, I felt like by the time I had it ready, I felt like almost like a first timer again. So there's a bit of kind of anxiety around that, but in terms of the journey of writing it, it was quite similar, but very different, trying to do different stuff.
Yeah. Do you want to read a bit for us?
Yeah, I will.
Good.
I'm going to take full advantage of a Tuesday afternoon crowd in West Cork to just read a few bits that I like that don't really work together, but hopefully give a good flavour of the different, because the book has lots of different voices or some different kind of styles as well. So like the stuff of the text is drawn from like things that are said off air between people and things that are said on air between people, and then there's always these two people kind of commenting, and there's things that are just happening in the static of the world around it, and they all sound a little bit different. So I'm just going to read for 5 to 7 minutes, maybe 8. Different people doing their thing. They're all very short pieces and self-contained, but they won't make a whole lot of sense, but they might, you never know, they might be nice. Anne, in her front room, in her chair, a wealth of cushions propping her up, and a wealth of tablets taken to ease the pain and sharpen the mind. But the pain was bad, the nausea worse, and the mind remained foggy. The kids were both home for the evening, and the plan was to watch a movie. Jerry was around the house somewhere too, doing something. She couldn't remember what. Making something? And the 2 kids were on their phones on the couch. And they weren't kids anymore, they were adults. Big lumps of things with slumped shoulders on her couch, both in their own worlds on their own phones. The son looked up at her and smiled at her. "What are we watching then, ma'am?" "God," she said, "I haven't a clue. No, sorry. That's grand. If Jerry's had his way, it's going to be one of those shitty car chase things." How much time had passed? The door swung open, and Jerry came in with 2 cups of tea in each hand. It was as if he had walked into her life again after years away. She smiled at him. "Hello, Jerry, my love." "Hello, Antoinette, my darling. I have a cup of chamomile here for the patient and 3 real cuppas for the rest of us." And another wave of pain came. Wave of pain, wave of nausea. And then they were saying something else, talking about someone else, some man in the next bed over. And then it seemed they were watching a movie. This is a dream sequence, which the editors tried to get you to take out. Off air, as they rolled eternally backwards, the giant head asked him from the front seat, "Have you a wife, Tony?" "I do," Tony replied. "Nuala, married 20 years. Good man. She's well?" "Yeah, she's great." "And how would you know about that now?" the gaunt woman asked him, beside him there in the passenger seat. "She would have to spend time with her to know." "We have our ups and downs, I suppose. Anyone would over 20 years. I suppose you never really know if someone's right for you. No matter how long it goes on, you..." "We went to the land of women once, Tony," the giant head bawled. "Oh yeah? The one time. It was a year. What a year, Tony. But when we came back, I didn't know a soul." "Listen to the two of ye," the gaunt woman said, "and the thoughts ye do be thinking." "Go on, you," the head said to her. "Did you ever think about this though, Tony? Where does a fly live?" Tony thought about it. They rolled backwards in the car down the hard shoulder. "You've got me there, my friend." The gaunt woman huffed impatiently, her hands covering her face in mock anguish. "Put him out of his misery. A fly lives nowhere, Tony, and yet everywhere. On the wind, on the wall, under a leaf, nowhere at all. The fly lives in the world, Tony." Now we're out in the world. The lights changed and Lou was off again. The traffic heavy eastbound on the south ring. Cars rolling with ease from slip road to slip road, switching in and out of the lanes. She navigated it all with a sort of muscle or machine memory, driving without thinking about driving, a consciousness beneath thought. All the cars and their drivers seemed to do the same, but maybe more than that too. These indications she made as she drove, that they all did, the physical spaces between vehicles and road markings created and closed and let out again. Sometimes it felt as if all that movement was preordained somehow, as if driving she were on a conveyor belt, being pulled along gently through some between space, as if the road and its roundabouts and slip roads were another existence, at a remove from the idea of Cork as a place that she grew up, where countless born and grew old and died, as history, Cork as a marsh once, as a frozen land before that, as homes and offices now, where citizens, the population, had their various roles to play and jobs to do. It felt like ebbing out here in infrastructure, the architecture of the landscape diminishing into something new and separate. She thought again about movement essential versus movement local. Words like route and commute came to mind. Billboards off the dual carriageway offered office space and scrappage. Banks of scrubland slipped by her, and industrial buildings and office blocks amidst car parks. All this minutes from their home in an ancient city. The more she tried to think about it, to cover it in her mind, the less sure she was of what she was even trying to understand. Was it the world she was trying to figure out, or herself? Or was the soul out there somewhere, lost in the sprawl? She remembered now when she'd worked in the East Village bar in Douglas, collecting glasses. How old had she been then? 17? And she used to drop Mark home after work, her first and only boyfriend. He lived in Blarney or near it, and when she'd be driving back the pitch black road from Blarney into the city, she'd try to look into that great dark sky, an entire ever-expanding universe, and she tried to make out the meaning of things. The pub uniform stinking of beer and bin juice and smoke, her eyes pricked open but unable to see what she needed to see. Sometimes at night now she still felt it, in bed, next to Martha, awake, unmoving. She hadn't scratched the surface of that massive blackness. There was surely more to life, an immensity to be fathomed. Losing her virginity to Mark, she remembered saying in the back of the car, "Are there any children? Just don't get me fucking pregnant," and him laughing in the gloom. Then Martha's voice came back to her. My alcoholic, cancerous parents? Your cancerous, alcoholic parents? Are you crazy? And yes, what kind of a dying world was it to be a parent in? She heard the stories every morning. She produced the stories. But yet, now, why was she constantly thinking about having babies? But then what had Mam said in London? You came along then, Lou, and kicking away inside me, you kicked even more room into my heart for loving. Lou saw in the distance the tops of cars moving along another flyover, pulled by a parallel conveyor belt, another circuit repeating, and then, without it seeming like another moment had passed, she was out in Cove, parking neatly along the curb by a long grey wall, and the music on the radio died with the engine, and the sun was coming out along the pavement. Thank you.
One of the things about All Along the Echo, and it was also an early King, is like layout. It was a very visual kind of thing. If that, and I know obviously if you're reading a novel, it has to be visual because you've got to look at it. But you know what I mean? They have a very interesting kind of typeset layout, and you play with that a lot. Tell us about that.
Partly it's not being able to write a consistent narrative over like 250 pages.
That's
I just don't have the
clever,
attention
Danny.
span to do it. My mind keeps wandering off going, what if this could happen and what if this could happen? But then the excuse that I kind of make to back up that lack of kind of singular focus is that both of the books I think of them as documents in a kind of I don't know, would it be an anthropological sense? Like that they're supposed to be a record and they're supposed to work together. Like the early King, it's never stated, but it's supposed to be a load of fragments of documents, and you can imagine that someone's found them and pieced them together. And they all, if you read them all in whatever order, they should make up the story. There are different versions of the same story at different times, like the play scripts, the testimony from the guard, and then the kind of unfinished novel. That tells the story of the kid. And with this one, it was kind of those, I was trying to do they're like different radio channels, so the off-air stuff, the on-air stuff, and the stuff in the static. They're supposed to all kind of work together, but that I would repeat that like that's my making an excuse so that I don't have to write 250 pages of the same person.
I'm very convinced by the excuse. I think it's a really good one.
Yeah, and it's not going to change because I already know the next book is going to be even more broken up and fragmented.
And like because it's all about voices and stories. I mean, so much of it, you didn't read any of them out there, but so much of it is like conversations Tony has with callers on the radio and stuff. So obviously the way people speak is very important then. So when you're writing that, like, do you read it aloud to yourself? Do you talk to yourself that way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's embarrassing. But that's the only way. And I've seen one or two students or former students here, and they would have been sick to death of me telling them every time I saw them to read their work aloud. I think it's really, really important. There's me. Now I work in the shed these days, so I don't think anyone can hear me anyways, but it used to be in the bedroom, so we kind of whisper reading, as dramatically as I could.
Yeah, and like Niamh, your dialogue as well is very realistic. Like I can hear, and you do this thing where you will pepper it in with like ums and likes and stuff like that. So do you do the same? Do you kind of chat away to yourself as you write?
Yes, absolutely. I always read it aloud. It's partly for the flow, and also to see where the internal rhyme is or where the shape is. And I think I'm very much in one frame of mind for the duration of a book, and then it's gone. So sometimes I'm looking at it now and reading it, and I don't see where that rhythm was supposed to be. It's kind of gone or changed. But so sometimes I think they have unwieldy sentences quite a lot of the time, but at one point that had a march
made total sense,
that I understood. I just think it's just being in the zone of it. But I read everything, and the same, just sometimes people can hear you or you have to I would read it aloud, for instance, to my partner quite a lot as well. So it absolutely has to be read out loud, definitely. Yeah, it's so important.
Yeah, agreed. Danny, in All Along the Echo specifically, there's an awful lot of Egypts. There's a great fondness, I think, for Irish Egypts. All these people ringing in, all these. Like it reminded me, I used to work in a building contractors down in Cork myself, so we'd have the radio on to the ring-in shows, and the voices of these people bringing in with their extremely important concerns, like would echo through. So there you go. So there is a fondness, though, Danny.
Yeah. There's a fondness, but there's also accuracy is really important. And if you do turn on the radio at any given time, if you turn on Joe Duffy at any given hour and listen for half an hour, you're going to hear more than one Egypt.
You are.
And so it would be poor writing if I was to have 250 pages of a book with no Egypts. But I think the Egypts, like, there's two things. The Egypts are kind of funny, right? If you don't take them seriously, they're like relief. But also, like, one of the things I love about the radio, which I don't get in my life that much anymore, is hearing people who I just don't agree with. You know, like, the only way I can disagree with someone now is to watch a sport with them over a pint or two or something, and then we can have different interpretations of what's happening on the telly. Politically, like I don't really know any, say, very right-wing people. Maybe some of my family, but I don't see them very often. And like, I'm not on Twitter anymore, but when I was on Twitter, I would only follow people like me.
Yeah.
So the only way, like, you can hear someone say that Trump is a great leader is by turning on the radio. Do you know? That kind of thing. So I realized that I like that in my life. I like hearing people that I can disagree with, now it can be frustrating if I have too much. Like, I don't listen to those radio shows now that much. I listened to them a lot when I was writing the book. But definitely a kind of a sense of pluralism was missing from my life, and I thought I should put that down in the book because that's accurate, and it's maybe not that. Maybe people don't experience it so much anymore. There's a kind of an echoey chamberness.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. I think you're stronger than me, though, because I'd throw the radio through the window, I think.
But I also presume it would all get cut out. Like, there's a guy talking about paedophiles in there. There's a guy talking about legalizing prostitution in a very selfish kind of way.
I recall.
And I presume, I was like, well, I'm just going to leave these in here because I think it's funny and it's a bit drastic. But I'm sure they'll get pulled, but they never did get pulled.
It is Tony's job as well to kind of, like, as the presenter, to try and reel this all out and kind of make it entertaining and stuff. So
they'll prod and poke, like, if there's a lefty caller on, the presenter becomes right wing, and if there's a kind of drastic caller on, he becomes the lefty. Like, these presenters, like the ones I was listening to anyway, they're highly skilled at their jobs.
They're very good.
Like, you know, they're brilliant. They're just basically devil's advocate for those 3 hours or whatever.
So if anyone was missing 96 FM or anything, Danny's book is the way to go. Niamh, you have a different cast of Egypts, I would say. I'm really not quite sure about this. Because Niamh's characters, because obviously Cormac is our protagonist, but he does hang around with, outside of his family, mostly other artists as well, who have all their kind of their own particular notions and stuff. It must be hard, or I felt anyway reading it, it was hard to feel the same kind of like jocular warmth towards them that I might for the Egypts calling in on the radio. Like, I found them quite like frustrating in their kind of like viewpoints or their selfishness in some case, and that must have been interesting to manage from your point of view.
Yes, I was part of the sort of source of satire, and also the way that it would make sense to live in quite a small world, which is based around making art and ostensibly needs to keep itself quite pure, but is very allied to in most places in Europe, I'd imagine, a market, but in Ireland it's actually state funding, which gives it another interesting spin, because there's quite a lot of, at least there's a notional idea on a sort of scale of authenticity, of sort of social justice service. Yeah. So there's an increasing level of, like, there's another layer of po-face potential for comedy there, because you can laugh at people who think they're helping the world. But also, I am an artist myself, and I do have feelings about writing and morality that I was playing around with, like asking myself exactly how much do you really buy this, and a certain amount of absurdity around it, or what are you really looking at? And I was interested, there is a theme in the book of art that's based on women's suffering in Ireland, which is partly my sense of coming of age as an artist in a world in which this was kind of a very instant hit for virtue or validation, would be if you took this topic up. But the question of, when we look at this history that we're still living with, where does that really fall? How can someone like me, who's no experience of it directly, actually somehow atone is that what I'm really doing? Am I looking for kudos by drawing attention to something everybody already knows about? Or where do I fit in? And it's not as simple as saying you should leave it alone because it's decadent to do that. It's more like, well, actually, there's lots of layers to it. So the character of Cormac's mother, Joy, is someone who has been through this system. And that's kind of, it's not made too overt. I think I might have cut some things in the end. But in particular, I was reading up about the frequency of involuntary electroconvulsive treatments on patients in Grange Gorman, which is now a college university campus, in the 50s and 60s, and there were members of my own family who went through that. So, and that idea that there was this buried history of potentially quite traumatizing psychiatric interventions, particularly in the lives of women who were then just sort of put back out in the community and then nobody would talk about it again. And I was thinking of this throb running under Life of the State, where all of these traumas that have particularly been directed at women really were there. They really did have an impact, but I'm not sure if there's a relationship between Joy, the character, the mother, and the world Cormac is working in.
Yeah, there is that disconnect, isn't there? It's like, it is a kind of an artificial, almost recreation of some sort of feeling that we're supposed to have rather than...
It is, and that is, so even writing the bourgeois realist novel, which I can't stop doing, is feeding into that, and I know it is, and I find it, I'm very comfortable in ambiguous and ambivalent zones, but I'm not sure if everybody else is, but there's also just a lot of humour to be taken from a certain po-facedness about art that's just too easy not to use.
Even right from the off, when Cormac goes like, he comes out of that performance piece and he goes like, it was a bit wordy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I was just skitting because you would be afraid to say it. You would feel something like that if you went to something. You'd be afraid to say it though.
You would be. Even I was afraid of saying that. I can't believe I got away with it so far. There was something many years ago I witnessed at a conference that I won't go into any detail about, but somebody was kind of secondhand delivering a description of having gone to something. And it seemed to be very in that moment, this person was really believing that there was some kind of atonement going on. And I found it intriguing because I wasn't convinced. And I think, even when you're talking about the echo chamber, that kind of economy of hysterical identification and hysterical empathy and emotion, which is very real, but it's coming from the individual. There's a limit to actual human capacity to feel the pain of someone else. It's your pain. And I think there's that, making it externalized in this world of constant triggers and horrors is a displacement activity. And this book is also about somebody whose displacement activity is their entire life.
Yeah, that was very profound. Actually, do you want to read a little bit first?
Yeah, I'll actually read what is sort of a slightly insubstantial bit that doesn't have sex in it, too much swearing. I had to think about the audience. So I wasn't sure who was going to be here. I haven't been at things that were children at. And interestingly, does include the mother. So this is just Cormac, who is the protagonist. He's in his late 30s, he's a photographer, and he's home visiting his mother in the small town where he grew up. And the thing to know about this is the event that's described in this sequence is something that he goes on, or he went on at some point in his later life to attempt to make a film treatment of. So that's why it's kind of being recalled. So his mother's name is Joy. Over breakfast, Joy says, "Your one who had the post office years ago is after dying, Mrs. Lynch." "I don't know who you mean," Cormac tells her calmly. He spreads Floralite on white toast. The Cork placemats are decorated with a Flemish vanitas of tumbling grapes and polished apples, pumpernickel in a copper dish. The teapot wears its cosy scorched with ring marks from the hob. "And you know who's out of prison?" "Let me guess." He guesses her second cousin, the one who drove away from a drunken collision in '96, but then mounted the pavement and took out the parish pump. She dismisses this with a wave. Sure, he's out years. "I mean Macpherson, who went in for..." "Donny Foley," Cormac remembers. Wow. With a ripple, it is given back to him. He was 12, and Thomas was still alive. The house was asleep. It was a Sunday morning in summertime. The day was bright and scented and tensely feminine. Because he was up early, he ate breast, gouged from a cold roast chicken in the fridge. The screen of firs in the garden cast the kitchen in shadow, but outside, it was spring. I can just see myself, he thinks now. There's a vertigo to going back and letting scenes compose themselves again, the rag and bone, the swallowing wallow of emotional recall. He took the bike and cycled out of the narrow street towards the town. The day was so nice he wanted to break it up in bits or destroy something. Years later, in cities, he would marvel at Sunday mornings and their gorgeous industry. Cafe terraces chattering, twisted bed sheets, headaches with the weight of sexual complication. Weekends in childhood were interminable, either tautly solemn as the services of Easter week or dull with rain and spin lines with grinding Formula One races on TV. At 12, he would have begun at the Franciscans. He would have been masturbating morosely 3 to 5 times a night. He would have entertained that dream of slitting throats. On this morning, there was a route Cormac could take on the bike, a brother's cast-off, to the top of the town and the long green lane of bungalows at Flemington. This would siphon him into Gormanston, a tunnel of trees and clamouring birds, and past the cattle grid at the school. He could take this road as far as a barnyard with a pig smell just before the turn for Ring Commons, Jordanstown, where the quarry with its drone of engines was open. Workmen captivated by reversing trucks, standing in a spell like saints, raising their arms eventually to beckon forth. They never noticed a boy on a bike weaving the perimeter, but he didn't feel like taking this route today. He circled a block instead. All was melancholy. The familiarity made him melancholy. The blue sky and the creamy cell of settled air, sweet with the closeness of fields uninterrupted by traffic yet, was laid on like the forced fun of an unwanted holiday. He was drifting by the silos of the factory that had been condemned, about to pass the football green, when the flicker of a squad car light caught the side of his eye, and Cormac turned at once to stand on the pedals and piston thickly in its direction. There was a small crowd on the football green. Through the bodies he saw Gardaí, tape, and a deposit like greyish snow, which he realised on approach was a dead person with a duvet, an uncovered duvet, polyester fritted visibly, thrown over it. What is it? What is it? He asked, so desperate to know his voice came out in a whine. Some lad got his head smashed in, a man explained. He was a lean man in a tracksuit, and Cormac recognised him from football practice, which was undertaken in series defined by age and league, under floodlights and between little coloured cones of plastic. This man, satisfied with his simple authority, turned back to the scene with folded arms. Most people were quiet. The police stood basking somewhat in their attention. Then and afterwards, they reminded Cormac of harmless, hand-fed animals. They were waiting, somebody said, for a tent. One guard at last detached himself from the hood of the car and walked towards them, saying blandly, "Here now, nothing to see here." The absurdity of it made Cormac laugh. His laugh was so stupidly loud, strained with a stressful glee, that everyone, some dumpy women, some children with bikes, the man in the tracksuit, turned to him. "Of course there's something to see," he cried at them, hysterical. Seconds passed as the strangeness of the situation caused him to feel cleaved from the moment, as if he were standing alone outside something. At last, the tracksuit man put a hand on his shoulders and said kindly, "Shut up the fuck." "Move on or we'll call your parents," warned the Garda. "Who is it?" One of the women asked the Garda plainly. She asked in a tone of resolve, as if, vehement, she was done with being messed around. "We don't know yet." "We do," said another man. "It's Donny Foley." Cormac was pained to realise he had no idea who Donny Foley was. The name suggested someone ancient and uninteresting, an old man, purple with age and alcohol, ambling blank-eyed over the football green after the pubs closed. In fact, as he would later learn, Donny Foley was a loner in his 30s who lived with his mother and fell asleep smoking cigarettes. This became part of the myth, since he'd come to the attention of police for starting 2 separate fires in his mother's house, fires that spread aggressively because, they said, of a superfluity of VHS tape. Videos, their ribbons loose, in untidy and proximate stacks. Foley had now been attacked and his head kicked hard. Under the exposed duvet without envelope, this detail callous afterwards. His eye sockets were black with hemorrhage. I made that part up, Cormac thinks. I embellished.
That's Cormac always trying to put a narrative on things, isn't he? Bloody artists. So they're both the novels we're talking about today, they're both definitely city books. And Dublin, the capital, and Cork, the real capital, you know. That's fine. When you're writing, like I love writing about cities myself personally. So, your Dublin, Niamh, that you write about, I mean, the specificity of place is very much there. But it's a Dublin that's kind of concerned with almost an erosion of community. It's something the artists, I say this like this is like one blob of a character. The artists are concerned about gentrification, they're concerned about being priced out. That must have been very deliberate.
Yes, I was looking at writing about Dublin and wanting to do that. I was living quite close to the city at the time, and I did have this sense of a social life that was quite small, that you could go out and people were going to the same things, and there's a community. In many ways, it's a self-conscious one, and it kind of overlaps with a clique and so on. And the joy of writing about a city as small as Dublin is that you can take sort of concerns that would be relevant everywhere, but shrink them down to the most provincial possible size and expose the absurdity and contingency of it in a kind of a fun way. But I was, while I was writing it as well, there was this sense of hotels being put up everywhere, and shared spaces that had cropped up after the crash were all gone. And I mean, it's gotten even worse since then, and people were leaving. And there was a kind of sense of clinging perhaps to an idea of something, of bohemian urban life, that was ultimately not going to be sustained.
Yeah, and it's not something that the book just kind of allows the reader to agree with. It's challenged as well in parts where not all characters are kind of on board with this, like, oh God, isn't a terrible take on the whole thing.
Yeah, there is a scene where that was another one that I felt a bit worried about the reaction to, where we have an artist talking to a sort of community organizer. And both of them are holding forth for different reasons for the same thing, trying to spare the city for the people, but who they understand the people to be is different. Yeah. And they don't really get anywhere. And it becomes like a photography shoot. It does. And it's quite cynical to sort of just rehash this and sort of say, look how redundant it is. But it did feel like, again, I'm looking closely at my own life and saying, like, what does this contribute? Where does this end? But I did have an important scene where two characters are going to a derelict house that is being held by a landlord that has been the site of a protest and has been cleared out, which did really happen in Dublin. And I got that from, I briefly was interning in the Irish Research Council, and one of the projects there was an attempt to actually record every vacant property in Dublin that was being held, and to track who owned it, and to make a case to the government for penalties. So it was a very good idea, and this was kind of how I kind of put that in there, as if this is what's really happening. And they're going and looking at these houses that are empty, and that kind of dereliction is supposed to feed into the idea about kind of like the lives of the characters themselves and their relationships with each other. So it's sort of a metaphor too.
We like those in literature.
Useful.
In your version of Cork, Danny, I think is very different. I think it's still a place that is held together by a kind of shared values and community and stories and all that, possibly like at least how Tony sees it, or at least how he helps it along.
Yeah. Well, like, one of my things was, I didn't live in Cork when I started writing the book, but I had this experience of every time I came home to Cork, spending less and less time in like feeling like I was in like real places. Like, we have a kind of a unique family situation in terms of the town where I grew up and now live. No one else in my family lived there. Everyone left Passage when everyone was an adult. My parents split up and they went to different places. So I never felt like I was coming home to home, but I had all my friends were here, and places I loved going in the city were still there. So I kind of had places that I haunted, but nowhere I felt fully this is a place at home. Like, I know that, like, if we had stayed in Passage, I could go to Passage and I know who'd be at the cross on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. I know who I'd see in the shop, who I'd want to avoid in the shop. And I didn't have any of that. So I was kind of trying to, and I was thinking about it more, and I read this, I read a book about, a book called Non-Place, about kind of hypermodernity, and that was a kind of that's a kind of a common experience, that we spend more and more time on dual carriageways, in garage forecourts, in shopping centres, in places of transit, or they don't feel like real traditional places, like they're not like little plazas or piazzas or village squares or whatever. So I was kind of trying to map that experience into what it might be like to live in Cork and spend all your time in traffic on the South Ring dual carriageway, or driving back and forth. But the thing that always felt still completely visceral and local and drenched in place were the voices who would be ringing up the radio and complaining about sewage leaks on their road, or the price of rent or derelict houses obviously has been a huge broadcast conversation in Cork and Dublin and probably beyond for a decade now probably. And so here, like people who knew their places inside out, and I can't do the accents, but I could place an accent. I could tell you like where I reckon the person. I could tell a Cove person from a Grona Braher person, from a Passage person, from a Kinsale person. So I felt like place was alive in the voices, and that might be almost the last place that it felt like it felt when I was growing up, that kind of way. Yeah. So it's kind of just kind of boring nostalgia, but mapped onto a kind of an idea of place as a receding thing, and maybe voice as kind of...
Because even within that, that's not the whole story of Echo either, because you have like the likes of Jada/Aero's experience of the city as a homeless teenager is completely different again, and in that very modern sense of homelessness, like she's not on the street. Tell us a bit about her.
Yeah, so they're staying in a hostel. Yeah. And it like a similar thing, like homelessness is just, it's not really a far-fetched idea that you might want to tackle in a novel theoretically. It's just like a reality. If like the book, I don't know how, I've never counted them, but there's like probably 100 characters in the book. 100 people get a line. Some of them have to be homeless, because I'd say 1 in 100 people are homeless in Cork. Like it's wild. Or not homeless in Cork, but worried about homelessness. Could be evicted any day and they just can't afford a place, and there's a 4 or 5 year wait on council homes if you are in a hostel or
4
whatever.
4 or 5.
Yeah.
If you're in a hostel, I was going to say this 4 or 5 years is very low. But if you're in a hostel, I see what you mean.
You could be waiting 4 or 5 years to get a council home and things, or that's what they're saying at the moment. But so it was just a reality that I was going to have to figure out. And my better half works, she's a youth worker, so she works with a lot of people like Jada, so it was kind of picking her brains a lot. And one of the things was anger. It was probably something that I never experienced, so it didn't jump to my mind as to what I would feel as a teenager, but it's like anger at the parents, anger at everything basically, and feeling completely disenfranchised.
Yeah, and her parents as well, like while Jada is quite angry, her parents are kind of obviously trying to put the brave face on or something, and she's frustrated at the fact that they are not showing the same anger and fear that she seems to be trying to deal with.
Yeah, but her parents are also useless.
I was trying to be nice to them.
No, they're useless. And it's that, I bet we all have this of, you get to a certain age and you think you know better than your parents. So Jada's like 14 years old and she already thinks she knows better. And she kind of in many ways does know better. But there's a bit of that going on. They get a bit of money and they decide to go out for a meal instead of putting it towards their deposit or whatever, and she loses the plot.
Yeah.
But
I'm running out of questions here, but I'm also conscious that people might have questions. So I'll give it a second if anybody wants to chime in with anything. I assume that's okay. I didn't check beforehand. But I have too many, so I do have more in case anyone is...
The roving mic is being prepared.
Is it being prepared? Oh, there's...
It's roving.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm just curious, because you both written about cities, and you've both lived in those cities. And I'm just wondering how important you think it is to be in the place you're writing, and how much distance can either help or hinder the process. And do you see those cities in different ways when you move away from them and when you live or visit somewhere else? And do you see them differently when you return?
That's a great question.
I started writing out of a lack. So I started writing when we lived in Spain, this book. But I did find when we came back, I was like, oh yeah, there's this, and oh yeah, there's that. So it was a big advantage to be there once I got back. But I did start without it. And the kind of places I was trying to write, like there's a lot of time spent in the car on dual carriageways and motorways in my book, and in shopping centres. So like, I maybe didn't need to, like, it's not as physical as Niamh's would be. I don't know. I think each writer will figure out their own way to do it as well. Like I could imagine someone writing, like one of my favourite westerns is J.T. Yates and St. Agnes' Last Stand. And it's set in, I think, Wyoming. And it turns out the writer was from Sheffield and never left England, ever. So like, people will find their own way.
When I was first writing, we were young, I was going to exhibitions or on nights out and then putting them into the book straight away. So they were actually happening in real time. And I did a certain amount of that with the first book as well. Just kind of using things. I kind of always looking for scenery.
The trauma.
Yes, always looking for scenery or backdrop. And I did use a lot of people's actual art as the art. And they're all listed, they're all credited, so that I kind of felt bad about that. But so that was very immediate and very, I was kind of enjoying taking seriously the very small world of a clique. But then I edited it in lockdown and I was living in Kildare, so it became much more spectral and much more hypothetical and a city that served the ends of my narrative instead of being real. And things like unlikely jumps from one place to the other that wouldn't make sense if you actually did them. I felt able to start doing that. But most of all that's interesting for me is that I knew this book was going to be published. It had already been bought by an English publisher. And I wondered about the hospitality of non-Irish readers to reading that much detail about an Irish city.
Yeah, it's really specific.
It was almost provocatively so, where it was making these illusions that were like, you're not going to even know what this is, to see how far you could push that, because I have this idea about precision of location as an alternative to kind of non-space. To banality and to this book can be marketed anywhere. And I think it might have been a bad idea in terms of money making.
But I definitely like the idea of I love reading a book. I might not know the place, but it's really I think of the first time we met, one of the things I was fanboying you about was it's just so fit. You're there in a place, it's real, it has weather, and I felt like less and less books actually paid attention to that kind of intense feeling of space or place. But I wouldn't care if I was reading about Dublin or Timbuktu. I don't think once it's like that. No. But you reckon it wasn't great for sales? I
feel as if there's maybe I wanted to also write a book which was a kind of modern, urban, sort of middle class, late stage capitalism experience, kind of slightly parodying that being the subject of a lot of writing, but putting it in this provincial place, this place that is kind of just really decentered, even though it creates its own importance, as a comment on the bigger movement in fiction towards this. I just don't see anybody picking that up yet. I see this kind of, it's very, very Dublin, this is only a book for people in Dublin, which isn't my aim, but it's interesting. I think I feel the same. I think when I was writing my first book, I used to buy a lot of books in translation from a bookshop called, it was the one, it's on Parnell Street, the name is going out of my head, in Dublin. Chapters.
Yeah.
I can't remember what they were called or who wrote them, because I read them and gave them away immediately. I was just doing it, and I read books that have been translated from Arabic and books from South America. There were just fiction that was coming out in South America and in Iran that was totally insanely different to anything I was reading, but it was still kind of realist style, but they were describing just worlds that had some similarities and some that didn't, presuming that these books were not being translated to English. They weren't addressing an English audience, and I got a lot from that experience.
Yeah, I like that. I don't want to be pandered to. If I'm reading about something that I don't know about, I want to experience it as I don't want to be.
You want to be dropped in the world. You don't want to be given a tour. You don't want to be given a tour of another place. You want to be just dropped in the place and figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, when you read it,
my reading anyway.
You can read a translation too where something has been very localized to the language that they think you're using, and it's usually US English, and I find that really, really jarring. So
yeah.
It's an interesting movement against that now, I think.
Yeah. We don't have a huge amount of time left. I did want to ask, so Danny, there isn't a huge amount of arty people in all along the Echo. There is Jada, who finds an outlet for herself in becoming a graffiti artist. But when, towards the end, and this is not a spoiler, when we do meet a troupe of artists, it results in an apocalyptic hangover. And I was thinking, when I was drawing things together with the two books, I was thinking, well, Niamh is no slouch actually when it comes to writing apocalyptic hangovers either. Because unlike both of these books feature hangover sequences that I found very hard to finish. They're quite difficult. I take it that artists are I don't know, was Cormac able to process this into anything? I don't think he was. I don't think he was coping very well.
That was a very fun scene to write. And also I kind of felt as well like it's a little bit risky because it can be it's like a dream.
sequence. You think they're going to cut this. No one wants to see someone's MDMA high. But also, I think there's a tendency, there's certain kind of fiction and certain kind of cultural production, particularly around Dublin, which has a tendency, this is true in the 90s, especially in the noughties, to use the drug sequence as a plot bridge, or as something which transforms, or kills someone, or, you know, reveals. And I'm listening to like a lot of like performance poetry about this, and I did kind of want to show like a really terrible high, where people just sit in a room and vomit and don't have sex, and then have a terrible hangover.
And then the fear descends.
Have the worst day of their life the next day.
And you have to do things, as Cormac has he must go and function somehow in the city.
Yeah, and I just sort of wanted to do it as it doesn't go anywhere at all. It doesn't serve the narrative in any way.
Refreshing, which hangovers aren't. And Danny, also Tony and Lou have to drive home from Connemara, isn't it? Back to Cork with these terrible hangovers.
Nobody asks men if their work is autobiographical anymore.
Danny, is this sequence autobiographical?
I can tell you, I had a hangover. Well, I was a passenger actually. I offered to drive, and then thank my lucky stars when my friend said, "No, I'll drive." But I did a very, very hungover drive back from Connemara one time. Made it as far as your hometown, Gort. Well, your home. I don't know if it's your hometown. Made it as far as Gort. Only had to stop twice to vomit. And I didn't realize I was going to use that in the book, but it actually was the hangover was a plot point, because they have the night out, and then they're both going to do something significant the next day. But I was like, I don't want either of them to do it. They're both going to fudge it. They're going to cry off. And anytime I want to cry off on something, I'll say, well, I'm desperately hungover. I'm too hungover to do that now. So I was like, I need a hangover, and obviously you then want to convince people, so you make it a really desperate hangover.
It was horrific.
I think it's the only bit of product placement. I think one of them has a Lucozade. Tony has a Lucozade between his knees. I think that's the only product placement in the book.
I didn't even notice that.
And I'm happy enough to promote Lucozade during hangovers.
It is a truly excellent hangover cure, I think. We're pretty much finished. I have been told to say that the books will be for sale out here, but not the whole bookshop. That's what Emer told me to say, and that is I'm saying it. So I'm sure these two wonderful authors would be very pleased to discuss the books further and possibly put a signature on the books that are purchased, if you would be so kind. So it remains to me to thank very much Danny Denton and Niamh Campbell for a brilliant conversation that I wish could go on a bit longer.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.